All right, so today was Peachstate's fly-in over there, or at least it was a gathering, and we were supposed to take Lockheed over, and we actually did take Lockheed over, but on landing, we were on final approach, about 200 or 300 feet, and all of a sudden I heard a really loud snap, and the airplane rolled pretty hard to the right. Full left aileron wasn't enough to get me out of it. It kept rolling to the right. So the only thing, after I made sure the engine hadn't fallen off, the only thing that I could do was add power and pick the flaps up. I figured, based on what was going on, that the flap something had happened to the flap. And with the noise, I thought it had broken off the airplane. I mean, it was pretty violent, the way the whole thing worked out. I landed it back over here at Seven Lakes and had my son and his friend with us. But I landed back over here with no flaps and put the flaps down when I got here. The flaps went down, which means they're back to working. But they didn't come down as far on this side as they normally do. So it's definitely slipped a little bit. I don't know exactly what happened, but we're going to be taking this thing apart and trying to figure out what's going on. All right, so these are the pieces of wire that I found, and I'm going to show you where I found these, but it's not wire, it's actually the threads out of the inside of the flap control. So what happens here is, up here we have the actual worm gear. Let's see if I can get this thing situated. So we have the actual worm gear there that is sliding, that piece right there slides back and forth on. Those pieces of thread I found up here on the inside of this, and the thread pieces came out of that piece. So I think what has happened is that piece right there has stripped out, and now if I grab hold of the flap and pull on it, you can see that I can actually put the flaps up and down just pulling on that. It's just slipping up and down the worm gear. So that is the piece that has gone bad, and now it's just a matter of figuring out how to get it out. All right, so I have taken this screw, I cut the safety wire off of this and taken this screw out, and so now if you look here, we've got the screw out of this piece, and so now I've got to figure out how to get this nut off of the worm gear. And so when the flaps go up, it pushes this thing that way, and the problem that I'm having right now is we've got to figure out how to get that rod to go that way out of the way and not mess with the flap. So what I think I'm going to have to do is, there's about 4 or 5 of these attach points that are actually attached to that push tube, and I think I'm gonna have to go through and take each one of these off so that the flap will actually hang straight down and get out of the way, and that way I can actually push that thing all the way that way and hopefully get that nut off the end of the worm gear, because I'm gonna have to either find another nut or get one made or make one or whatever it ends up being. But I got to get it off of there so I can see what I'm looking at. All right, so once that screw comes out of here, this piece just unscrews, and it's not very tight, so there's not a lot of torque on it. So we're just gonna take this nut off of here, and right now it's turning down the worm gear, which is pushing the flaps down. But what we're really interested in is seeing what happens when we get these two guys disconnected from each other. All right, so what we've done is we've gotten the nut off of here, we've pulled it back to the left there, and now what we're going to be doing is, I'm not real sure because there's no manual on this as far as how to get this out. So what I'm planning on doing is taking this guide arm that comes down here, that's actually what picks the flap up and puts it down. I'm going to take the bolt loose up there, and then over here on the other side you'll see that are holding that in. And so what I'm going to do is take those two bolts out, and the piece here is a little bit bigger diameter. I'm going to see if I can slide it over the one on the right, because the problem that we're having right now, or that we're going to have when we get to it, is that we've got to get this push tube out from over the top of that worm gear, because in order to get the nut off, I've got to get the worm gear exposed about that much from the end so that I can actually get that all taken apart. So that's going to be our first attempt to get this off, is to loosen up or take those bolts out of the other side and see if we can slide it through. So I've gotten the two bolts out of here, and I got this piece here taken loose. This thing was pretty difficult to get out, so I'm looking forward to putting it back in. But the problem that I'm having right now is the joint that's up here isn't moving at all. I can't twist the pipe or move it in or out, so I'm now fighting with trying to figure out how to get this joint apart. So hopefully I'll be able to get that soon. Alright, so I ended up having to put the bolts back in this piece out here because I couldn't get the two pieces to spread apart or to go inside of each other. So what the plan now is, I'm going to try to take this piece here off the airplane. This thing's got a split collar that goes around a bearing, and then the nut and all goes onto the worm gear. So I'm going to try to take these two bolts here, take the 4 bolts that are holding this thing together, or I may even be able to just take those two out and have the bearing come out this way. And then I'm going to try to push that as far that way as I can and see if I can work the worm gear out of that nut, because at this point, if this doesn't work, I'm going to end up having to take a whole lot of stuff apart, all the way down the airplane. So I'm hoping that isn't what ends up having to happen. Alright, so what I'm trying to do now is, there are joints in here that run down the length of this pipe, this push rod, that I'm trying to get broke loose, but they're not coming loose either. So I'm really running out of ideas here for getting this thing out. The one down at the end, we put the nut back on so that we could try to get the thing to turn. We did get it to turn for that joint, but we couldn't get it to move in or out. And so then we decided we were going to take the cover off of the bearing down there and try to pull the worm gear out, but it won't come out with this push rod because it goes up inside the push rod. So then we decided, well, we'll disconnect this adjustment rod, this extension rod here, and then break it loose here or here, and try to pull the two ends apart. But we can't get that slip joint to come off because everything's kind of corroded itself together, I guess. I don't really know what's going on. And I just heated this up to try to see if I could get it to turn, but that's not working either. Yeah, I can't even get the slip joint there to turn, the outside piece of pipe to even turn around the two insides. So I don't know what is holding it together, but right now everything on here is being extremely difficult. So we're still trying to get the nut off of this thing so that we can replace the nut. Alright, so I have taken all of the straps down, all the pieces that actually move this thing up and down. I've taken them all off, so the flap is just hanging here now. And now what I've got to do is up here, this is the aileron drooper mechanism, and so I'm just noting the fact that it is the bulk of it is pointed toward the opening on the flap, the main gap. So I've got to take this loose next, and then what I'm going to try to do, if this works, is I'm going to try to go down here to the end and see if I can push this entire rod into the aileron cavity there, to see, you know, once I disconnect this, if I can get it to go all the way in there, and then that'll give me the room I need to be able to get this thing off. Alright, so here is what ended up happening. You'll see the bearing is out of the case. This guy is all the way over here. You'll notice a roller up at the top. There was a roller at the bottom. We had to take that roller out so that the piece would fit inside there, because we had to have it pushed far enough in to be able to get the worm gear out. So that's what we're left with at the moment. And then what we also had to do is we had to take all of the straps loose that are holding all these guys that are holding the the flap. We had to take the drooping mechanism for the aileron loose, had to take it out so that we could get so what's happened is that the line you see, the pipe you see back on the back, pushes inside behind the other one so that we could get them both out. Alright, so in true Glenn fashion, and you'll see how this works here in a second, but here's the worm gear that came out of the airplane. So we got the worm gear there, and you can see, if you can tell, what the problem is here. So let's see if I can get this thing to focus here. I don't know what the camera is doing. There it goes. So on the left is the one that came off of the airplane, and the one on the right is the one that I was going to put on the airplane. But as you can see, there is a problem. But you can see the threads on the inside of the good one. If I can get the camera to quit being stupid. What the heck? So there's the threads on that one. The threads on this guy are gone. I mean, you can still see a little bit of the threads, but they essentially, what has happened is all the threads on the main part of the thread has broken off of that thing, so it's just sliding up and down the worm gear. So we have a worm gear here, and then we've got our piece to go on it, but it's the wrong freaking size. So I've got 3 worm gears over here, two extra worm gears, and about 4 nuts, but for some reason they're different size than what came out of the airplane. So now I'm gonna have to figure out if we can make this or find it somewhere, but I have no idea where I'm gonna find it. All right, so we have the new screw in here. And we've got all the holes and stuff drilled so that we can get the safety nut and all that back, or the bolt and stuff back in there. So now what I've got to do is figure out the order to put this back together, because I can't screw the worm gear in with this thing on here, I don't think, because it's not going to. For one, I got this whole mechanism, the bearing and stuff on here that's still got to go into this little piece. But even without that, I've got all of the rods disconnected all the way down the flap, which means that when this thing is pushed in and out, I've got to get this thing adjusted so that when I hook all this stuff back up, it's all in the right spot. So I'm gonna have to think about this for a little bit and figure out what order I need to put this back together. All right, so step 1 of getting this thing to go in here is you have to get the bearing in. It's got 2 washers on both sides that keep all the dirt and stuff out. They got to get lined up, which they're at the moment the biggest pain in the butt, trying to get them to line up in the areas that they're supposed to go. Once this is in, the next thing is the pipe that pushes back and forth actually will move out far enough for the worm gear to go back up inside. So right now what I'm doing is trying to get the bearing in here and getting all this stuff set up, and then I'm gonna have to figure out exactly where to position this nut so that when I screw all this stuff back together, all of the pieces down the length will line up and fit. So I'm nowhere close to actually having a working solution, but I do know for a fact that the bearing has got to go in first. All right, I've got the bearing back in. I got the worm gear up inside the push tube here. So now the only big thing, and it is a big thing, is I got to figure out what position to put that nut to start screwing this in, so that when they're all said and done, this push tube is all the way up against that housing. So it's going to take a little bit of experimentation, I think, but that's what I think I've got to do next. All right, we're going to start down here at this end. This is the aileron drooping mechanism, and as you saw earlier, we had that disconnected, and so I'm going to kind of cover putting it back together in this part. So we want to leave that disconnected, and the reason's because we need to push the rod all the way into the hole over there. So the only way you can do that is with that to be left disconnected. That's actually the last piece that I ended up putting back together. Then you have this rod. All of the rods stay disconnected for putting this thing back together. So we're just going to kind of move back this way. As we said, that rod is disconnected. We ended up not using these joints because we could never get them broke loose. So all of that stuff just stayed like it was. That rod stayed disconnected. And then as we move up this way, that roller has to stay out because that is the only way to get the rod to slide in far enough. So the first thing that we did with this tube pushed all the way up against that housing, the brace there, we put the worm gear in, mounted the plate, got everything lined up, and mounted this stuff back together. Obviously plugged it into the little thing that lets it all spin. And then what we did is, with the nut disconnected, we pushed the tube, we unscrewed the nut so that it was back over in this area. Then we pushed the tube into the nut, and then we turned the tube and the nut so that we could screw them together and keep them out here so they didn't butt up against the inside of the case. And then once we got the thing together and put the lock screw back in it, then what we did is we turned the entire shaft until, and actually it turns this way, until it came all the way into the inside of the piece over here. And then once we got it into the inside, we then backed it off enough to get these pieces, get all of our shafts to all line back up and fit. So that's basically what we did to put it all back together, and then we just got everything mounted back up and adjusted. All right, the only other thing I wanted to mention is once all of this stuff is all hooked back up, you actually, what we did is we actually, and this is in the service manual, it's actually the only thing in the service manual, but essentially what you want is, as this flap lifts up and the motor kicks off, you don't want a lot of pressure on the wing right here, because there is a service bulletin that if this is out of adjustment and the flap comes up and pushes hard enough on this bottom of the wing, that it'll actually crack some of these pieces in here. And so the service bulletin is actually about going through and checking to make sure you don't have any cracks. But the culprit behind the whole thing is that this flap is, it's a pretty big flap, and when it comes up, if it's out of adjustment and pushes too hard on the bottom of the wing, that it can crack this. So once we got everything back together, we loosened all of these rods and then manually closed the flaps up to get, to see what kind of pressure we had, and then we just put them back down, adjusted them, put them back up, and you just basically do it until you get a nice clean seal all the way down the flap.